Okay, so today we're going to talk, it's just a fairly short, well, I don't know how long a lecture it's going to be. We'll have to just sort of see. It's not a complicated thing. The formula itself looks complicated. But once you understand what it is, it makes sense. And a lot of times I don't even think about the formula. I just think about, well, how do I get it from a graph? And so I just remember, oh, I know the Pythagorean theorem. The distance formula is just the Pythagorean theorem written differently. Okay? All right, so first of all, I'm going to write the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Now, I would rather have my c squared on my left side, so I'm going to rewrite it. C squared equals a squared plus b squared. So I didn't do anything. I just moved the c over to the other side. That's fine, right? No problem, right? If this equals this, well, this equals this. Doesn't matter. It doesn't, you can have them either way. But I want to solve for c, because c is technically the distance that we're looking for in the distance formula, right? Now, to solve for c, I would take the square root, right?
So that is the distance formula?
Not yet. Not yet. You'll see. I'm going to write the final distance formula. They actually use different letters, so you'll see. But if I wanted to find c, I would square root both sides, right? Right? Does that make sense? I'm not square rooting a squared and then stopping and then putting a plus and then square rooting b squared. I have to square root the whole side, okay? So that means basically c is equal to the square root of a squared plus b squared. All right, so now let's look at this. The problem is, if I have something on a graph like this, I'm going to put this in darker color because it doesn't show up too well on the graph, on the video. So if I have a triangle like that, and I am trying to find the distance between these 2 points, I'm going to call that d, which is really c, but now in our distance formula, they actually use the letter d in place of c. But it's still the same thing, right? And would you agree with me that this is the hypotenuse?
Yeah.
And would you agree with me that that is definitely a right angle?
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be, because, it's got to be. So that means this is my A, and this is my B, right? How do I find this? The distance from here to here.
Find A.
But that's what I'm saying. How do you find that? So how far is, I'm going to use a different color maybe. I don't know how to do this. How far is this from here to here? How far is that? That is, we'll call that x2. X sub 2. Does that make sense? Not yet, but it will. I'm just using variables for now. In this, I can tell you what it is. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's 7, but I'm just showing you it's x2. That is the distance from here, from the y-axis, all the way over to here, right? Now, what could I subtract from this line to get this? What could I subtract from this to get just this? What's in the way? This, right?
Yeah.
So I could subtract this. Does that make sense? I could take this whole thing and then subtract this, and then I would have just that, right? So this is my x sub 1. Does that make sense? You with me?
Yeah.
So x2 minus x1 gives me a. Oh, well then I can do this. I could say x2 minus x1 parentheses squared. That's my a squared, right? You with me? See how I did that?
Mm-hmm.
All right, now I got to find my b. My b is this. All right, so, but remember, it's going to be plus, just like this,
And this
plus.
is the distance formula?
This is the distance formula. We're creating it right now. And then we're going to put this in parentheses as well. right? And this is going to be, I want to find this distance from here to here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, what is the distance from the x-axis to here? That's my y2. Right? You with me? And then if I want to find from here to here, I just have to subtract this distance right here, right? That's my y1, right? So I don't know how to write all this. I'm kind of running out of space. But anyways, so if I take this distance, that's my y2, subtract this distance, my y1, that will be my b. y2 minus y1, and then I have to square it. That is the distance formula. It looks like a nightmare, but it
Y
isn't.
squared?
It's a nightmare, Gary.
It's
It's a nightmare.
Is it y squared?
sorry. I wrote that wrong. Sorry. I apologize. I wasn't thinking. It's y sub 2, y sub 1. Sorry.
I
So-
understand it.
What?
I understand it.
Okay. So now the question is, how do you use it, right?
Right.
So let's look at how to use it. Is there space here? I can go all the way up to here. Okay. So let's try it. So let's say I want to find the distance between. Well, let's do this one. So this is 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 310. I want to know the distance between 310 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 2. And 7, 2. All right. So it doesn't matter which one is my y1 and which one is my x1. It doesn't matter which one is my x1, y1 and which one is my x2, y2. Right? I can make this x1,
So is that d
y1.
equals that?
I can make this x2, y2, or I can make this x1, y1, and this x2, y2. but
They have to stay together.
They have to stay together. The ones are together and the twos are together, right? So I'm going to just, since it's easy to just, I'm going to say this is my x1, and this is my y1, and this is my x2, and this is my y2. Okay? So I just plug it in to my formula. So d, the distance between these 2 points, is the square root of I've got my let's see, I said x2. So 7, parentheses, 7 minus 3, that's my x2 minus my x1 squared, plus my y2, 2 minus 10 squared. Okay? Now notice, when I do this, this is always going to be a positive number, right?
It's pretty easy, isn't it?
Because I'm squaring. It's really easy, right?
Yeah.
So it's just this minus this plus this minus this. This minus this plus this minus this, right?
Well, what?
And then, but they're always squared here, because that's your a squared
so
plus
you're
b
going to do
squared.
like 7 minus 3
So
and then square
your d
4.
is equal to the square root of what's 7 minus 3? It's 4 squared
6.
plus 2 minus 10 is negative 8 squared. But think about that. That's going to be the square root of 16 plus, because negative 8 squared is positive 64, right? 64 plus that is 80, I think.
It's 80.
So the distance is the square root of 80, whatever that is. And if I wanted to know exactly in actual numbers, I get out my calculator and I put square root of 80, or 80 square root, however you
So
calculate it.
why doesn't it cancel it out? Like the 2 square roots, why doesn't it cancel the
Why doesn't what?
The square root cancel out the squared.
Ah,
On the
good
formula.
question. Oh, I get it. Because of this plus sign. If I didn't have that plus sign, you would be right. It would work. But I can't say, oh, the square root of 16 is 4 plus the square root of 64 is 8 or negative. I can't do that because of that plus sign. Because the square root is the square root of things that are being multiplied or a final value, right? But when you suddenly put a plus sign in there between two numbers, you can't square root each one separately. You know what I mean? That's why I said this formula is not the same. This is not the same as saying c squared is equal to the square root of a squared plus the square root of b squared. That is not the same thing, right? Because it's the square root of the sum of these, right? It's not the square root of this plus the square root of this, the square root of the sum of these. So that's not right. Okay, does that make sense? So it's just following this formula. So it's sort of like the point-slope formula, or not point, it's like the slope formula. Remember the slope formula? Your y2 minus y1 over the change in y of the change in x, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. Remember that slope formula?
Yeah.
It's sort of like that, but it's tricky only in that you have to be careful, right? So just do your x's, and I don't even bother writing x1, y1, and x2, y2. I just say, okay, this x minus this x squared plus this y minus this y squared, right? Whichever one you start with, you have to start with both, right? If I start with this x, I have to start with this y. And then I put a minus sign in this x, and then square, plus, because the formula has a plus. And then start with this y minus that y squared. Does that make sense? Pretty straightforward, right? Okay, so that's the distance formula. And it's really cool because if you had any line, let's say I wanted to do this line between these 2 points, and I asked you, what is the distance of that line? Well, you just create your little rectangle. This is my A and this is my B,
Triangle.
right? And so this is it. So basically, I just want to know what my x is at this point and my y is. I need to know these 2 points, right? Right? You don't even need to draw the graph, really. All you need to know is the points in order to use this formula. But if you forgot that formula, you can draw your right triangle and realize, oh, well, this is merely this minus this. And this is merely this minus this. Right? You see what I mean? It's really easy, even if you forget the formula. Sometimes I forget that formula because I don't use it very often. But when I do, I just go back to this. Oh, I know how to do that. All right, so that's the distance formula. Can I erase?
Yes.
Questions? You guys fist of five? Do you understand it? At least understand the process? And so all you have to do is substitute it in. This minus this squared plus this minus this squared. And then you square root that all, and that's it. All right, so I'm going to erase. Now there's one other kind of formula that you will experience. Actually, these things you'll actually experience next year in geometry, if for those of you who choose to take geometry. Some of you may choose to take Algebra 1 again. But
Or algebra
for
2.
those, what?
Or algebra 2 if you go to St. Mike's.
Right. St. Mike's takes you straight into Algebra 2, which I agree with, but nobody else does that as far as I know. But if you take geometry, you will definitely use these things next year. And so now the other thing is the midpoint formula. This is the easiest thing on the planet. This is so easy. Midpoint formula. Midpoint formula. All right, let's say, let me think here. You have 2 points again, right? So when I have 2 points, I have an x1, y1, and I have a x2, y2, right? 2 points, right? So if I have a point x1, y1, and I have a point what am I doing? x2, gosh, try this again. Okay, x2, y2. So I have those 2 points, right? And I want to know the midpoint. So I have a line. I've got this line right here. And I want to know the midpoint of that line. It's a piece of cake.
You're like, oh my god.
All you do is the answer is this. It's the average of the x's, comma, the average of the y's. So I'm going to say this. Average of x's, comma, average of y's. And then you'll see what I mean in just a second.
So we should write that as the formula?
That's the formula. And so if you all recall what average means, it means you add two things together and divide by the number of things you added together. Remember that? Right? So I'm adding the x's. So x1 plus x2 divided by how many did I add? I added two of them, so I'm going to divide by 2. Comma y1 plus y2 divided by 2. And that will give you the midpoint of any line.
Oh, that's ridiculous.
Is that Y2 or X2?
Where?
Oh, it's
No, why?
This is x1 plus y, oh, excuse me, x1 plus x2. I see what you're saying.
Yeah. There you go.
That's an
That's
x.
better.
Divided by 2. It's just the average of the x's, comma, the average of the y's. Right? So it's really easy. So let's try 2, -3, and 7, 8. I want to find the midpoint between those 2 points. Right? It's a piece of cake. Watch. 7 plus 2 is, those are my x's. It's going to be 7 plus 2 over 2, comma. Here's my y's. 8 plus a -3, which is 5, over 2. Right? So that's my midpoint. So 7 plus 2 is 9. 9 over 2, comma, 5 over 2. I could leave it like that, or I could write it as a decimal, but that's fine. I could say it's 4.5, comma, 2.5 if I want. Or I could leave it as a fraction. Does that make sense? Right?
Hang on.
So they're more fun when they come out as a whole number, but who cares, right? Fractions are fine. They're numbers too, right? Some people might turn it into a mixed number, but I don't like mixed numbers, to be honest with you, that much, because if I prefer either fractions or decimals
But it's
personally.
okay if we turn it into a mixed
You know what I mean? What?
Is it okay if we turn it into a mixed number?
Totally. I mean, it helps. Like sometimes the decimals are a little harder if you don't have a calculator. Like if it's 2/7, I don't know what that is as a decimal. I know what half of, 1/2 is as a decimal. But if it was a 7th, I don't know what that is a decimal. So then I'd have to use my calculator if I was going to use a decimal. Might be easier to just like 3 4/7, write as a mixed number. But anyways, that's it. So midpoint formula, average of the x's, comma, average of the y's. Immediately you know your midpoint, right? Piece of cake. So that's it. That's the lecture. Say what?